Before it could warm a belly, it had to break your back. In the medieval world, a single bowl of gruel could take hours of grinding, sifting, boiling, and blistered hands. There were no machines, no shortcuts, just stone, sweat, and endless stirring, and all that for something that tasted like sadness and hot water. If you thought making breakfast was tough today, imagine doing it with a quern stone and frostbitten fingers. Subscribe and hit the bell icon for more sleep-worthy struggles. From history's hardest mornings, comment below. Would you trade your cereal for a steaming bowl of medieval misery? You wake before dawn in the Nile Delta, sometime around 2500 BCE, to the sound of your neighbor already beginning her daily work. The soft scraping of stone against stone echoes from the house next door, a rhythm as constant as the river's flow. This is the sound that has defined Egyptian mornings for generations, the sound of women grinding grain, the most essential and most tedious task in the ancient world. Your name might be Nebet, and you are a farmer's wife in a small village outside Memphis. Like every other woman in your community, you will spend the next 4 to 6 hours of your day hunched over a saddle quern, slowly transforming barley and emmer wheat into the flour that will feed your family. This is not a choice, not a career, not something you do when you feel like it. This is survival, measured in the steady rhythm of stone grinding against stone. Grain by precious grain. The saddle quern sitting before you is deceptively simple. Elongated slab of rough granite, perhaps 2 feet long and a foot wide, with a shallow depression carved into its center. The depression is worn smooth from years of use, polished by the countless handfuls of grain that have been ground in its hollow. Beside it lies your handstone, a smaller oval rock that fits comfortably in both hands when you grip it properly. These 2 stones represent the cutting edge of food processing technology in your world, unchanged for centuries and destined to remain unchanged for centuries more. You begin as your mother taught you, as her mother taught her. A handful of barley grain, perhaps a cup's worth, is scattered into the depression of the saddle quern. The grain has already been winnowed, the chaff blown away in yesterday's evening breeze. But each kernel still holds the promise and the challenge of becoming flour. You kneel at the narrow end of the stone, your knees finding the familiar worn spots on the hard-packed earth floor where generations of women have assumed this same position. The handstone feels heavy in your palms. As you begin the forward stroke, you lean your entire body into the motion, pressing down with your shoulders, your back, your arms, all working in concert to crush the grain between the 2 stones. The motion is not simply back and forth, it requires a subtle rocking, a grinding, a careful attention to pressure and angle. Too little pressure and the grain merely slides across the stone, intact and mocking. Too much pressure and you exhaust yourself within minutes, your muscles screaming in protest. You settle into the rhythm that your body knows by heart. Lean forward, press down, drag the handstone across the grain, lift slightly, drag back, press down again. The first pass accomplishes little, a few kernels crack, releasing their pale interior, but most remain stubbornly whole. This is why the work takes so long. This is why you began before dawn. The grain dust begins to accumulate around the edges of the saddle quern, and you must frequently gather it back into the center depression, mixing the partially ground meal with the still whole kernels. Your hands quickly become coated with a fine powder that works its way under your fingernails and into the creases of your palms. The dust gets into everything: your hair, despite the cloth covering you've learned to wear, your clothing, the air you breathe. After perhaps 30 minutes of steady grinding, you have managed to reduce 1 cup of barley to a coarse meal. It is not yet flour, not by any measure that would satisfy a modern baker, but a rough, gritty substance that contains fragments of grain in various stages of pulverization. Some pieces are still recognizable as barley, stubbornly intact despite your efforts. Others have been reduced to powder fine enough to slip between your fingers like sand. But 1 cup, of course. Meal is not enough to feed a family. Your husband will need bread for his work in the fields. Your children will need their daily ration. If you are fortunate enough to have grain to spare, you will need extra to trade for the other necessities of life: salt, oil, perhaps a piece of cloth, or a new pottery jar. This means you will need to grind at least 6 to 8 cups of grain every single day. More during harvest season, when you might be preparing extra flour to store for the leaner months. You shift your weight, trying to find a more comfortable position on the hard ground. Your knees are already beginning to ignite the sharp pain of injury, but the deep, persistent ache of joints subjected to constant pressure and awkward positioning. This is the ache that archaeologists centuries in the future will find preserved in the very bones of Egyptian women, the telltale signs of a lifetime spent kneeling over grinding stones. The deformities they will discover are not subtle. The toe bones are often curved and twisted from the constant pressure of kneeling. The leg bones show signs of stress fractures and unusual wear patterns. The spine is curved in ways that speak of years spent hunched over, leaning into the grinding motion. The pelvis bears the marks of muscles strained beyond their normal limits, day after day, year after year. But these are discoveries for the future. Right now, you are simply trying to make it through another morning's work, another day's bread, another small victory against hunger. You have no concept of ergonomics, no understanding of repetitive stress injuries, no alternative to the system that has fed your people since time immemorial. As the sun climbs higher and the work continues, you find yourself thinking about your daughter sleeping soundly in the back room of your small house. She is only 6 years old now, still young enough to play with dolls made of rags and sticks, still innocent of the reality that awaits her. But in another few years, she will join you at the grinding stone, learning the techniques that will define her adult life. Her small hands will develop the calluses and strength necessary for this work. Her young body will gradually adapt to the demands of daily grinding. And someday, when you are old and your back is too bent to lean into the stone, when your hands are too gnarled to grip the handstone properly, she will take over this task completely. She will kneel in the same worn spots on the floor, grinding grain for her own children, continuing the endless cycle that has sustained Egyptian civilization for 1,000 years already. It will continue for 1,000 more. The grinding continues, methodical and relentless as it has every morning for as long as anyone can remember, and as it will continue tomorrow and the day after that, and every day for generations yet to come. But how did this system develop? What forces shaped the daily routine that now consumes so much of your life? And what lies ahead for the women who will inherit this burden long after you are gone? The morning grinds on quite literally, and as you work, you begin to understand something that visitors to your village never grasp. This is not simply about making bread. What you are doing at your saddle quern is maintaining the entire structure of Egyptian civilization, one handful of grain at a time. The pharaoh's pyramid building projects, the elaborate temples, the vast irrigation systems, the standing army, all of it rests on the daily labor of women like you, hunched over, grinding stones in 10,000 villages along the Nile. By mid-morning, your back has settled into a familiar ache. This is not the sharp pain of injury, but the deep, persistent discomfort of muscles and joints being used in ways they were never designed to accommodate. Your ancestors, for hundreds of thousands of years, were built for walking, running, climbing, carrying. They were not built for spending hours each day in a kneeling crouch, leaning forward at an awkward angle, applying downward pressure through their arms and shoulders onto an unyielding stone surface. But here you are, and here you must remain, because the alternative is starvation. The grain in your storage jars represents survival through the flood season, when the Nile covers the fields and no fresh crops can be planted. The grain represents security against the years when the flood fails to come at all, when the river remains low and the harvest is poor, and grain in its whole form is nearly useless. It must be processed, broken down, transformed from its natural state into something that can nourish human bodies. Your grandmother, who lived to the remarkable age of 52, used to tell stories about the old days when the work was somehow easier. But as you've grown older, you've come to realize that these stories were the kind of gentle lies that old people tell to make the present seem more bearable. The work was never easier. If anything, it has become slightly more efficient over the generations, as the technique of corn construction has been refined, as the best types of stone have been identified and quarried, as the knowledge of grain processing has been accumulated and passed down. The saddle quern you are using today represents the culmination of centuries of experimentation and improvement. The particular type of granite was chosen because it holds its shape well, but is abrasive enough to break down grain efficiently. The size and weight of the handstone have been optimized through generations of trial and error. The shape of the depression in the saddle quern has been refined to allow for the best grinding action while making it easy to collect the finished meal. And yet, despite all these improvements, the basic physics of the situation remain unchanged. A human being, using only muscle power, must apply enough force to crush hard grain kernels into powder. This requires significant pressure applied over long periods of time. The human body, regardless of how well adapted it becomes to this task, has limits that cannot be exceeded. You pause in your grinding to examine your hands. The palms are deeply calloused where they grip the handstone, but even the calluses cannot prevent the formation of blisters when the work is particularly heavy. During harvest season, when you might grind grain for 12 hours a day to process the new crop, your hands often bleed from the constant friction. The grain dust sticks to the blood, forming a gritty paste that must be scrubbed away each evening with sand and water. Your fingernails, what little remains of them, are permanently embedded with grain, dust, and flour. The fine particles work their way so deeply into the nail beds that no amount of cleaning will remove them completely. This gives your hands a perpetually dusty appearance, a badge of your profession that marks you as clearly as any craftsman's tool. But it is not just your hands that bear the marks of this work. Your entire body has been shaped by the demands of daily grinding. Your shoulders are unusually muscular for a woman, developed from years of leaning into the handstone. Your forearms are strong and thick, capable of maintaining pressure for hours at a time. Your back muscles, particularly in the lower region, are both overdeveloped and chronically strained from the constant forward leaning. Posture required for effective grinding. The effects go beyond mere muscle development. The repetitive stress of the grinding motion has begun to affect your joints in ways that will become more pronounced as you age. Your wrists sometimes ache from the constant gripping and twisting motion required to manipulate the handstone. Your shoulders occasionally freeze up, requiring you to stop work and stretch them carefully before you can continue. Most significantly, your knees bear the daily burden of supporting your body weight while pressed against the hard earth floor. Over the years, they have developed thick, tough skin that protects against the worst of the abrasion, but the underlying joints are beginning to show signs of wear. You have noticed that it takes longer each morning to work out the stiffness, longer to find a comfortable position for the day's work. As you continue grinding, you calculate the morning's progress. You have been working for nearly 3 hours now, and you have managed to process perhaps 4 cups of grain into usable meal. This is actually quite good some days. When you are tired or distracted, the work goes more slowly. But you still have at least 2 more cups to go before you can consider the morning's work complete. The social structure of your village revolves around this daily rhythm. The men leave for the fields shortly after dawn, expecting that the bread for their midday meal will be ready when they return. the children's breakfast depends on your completing at least a portion of your grinding before they wake. Even the village officials, when they come to collect taxes or organize work parties, time their visits around the assumption that the women will be occupied with grinding until mid-morning. This is not accidental. The entire economic system of Egypt has evolved around the reality of grain processing time. The work songs that women sing while grinding, the social rituals that have developed around communal grinding sessions, the timing of religious festivals. The scheduling of market days, all of these have been adapted to accommodate the fact that a significant portion of every woman's day must be devoted to this single task. You have heard rumors, passed along by traveling merchants, of places where grain is processed differently. Stories of communities that use large stones powered by oxen or donkeys, allowing the processing of much larger quantities in shorter time periods. But these stories seem too fantastic to believe. How could animals be trained to perform such precise work? How could the quality of the flour be maintained without the careful attention that only human hands can provide? Besides, even if such methods existed, they would require resources far beyond what your village could afford. The cost of maintaining work animals, the construction of specialized equipment, the organization of labor on a scale that would make such systems worthwhile. These are luxuries that belong to the wealthy temples and royal estates, not too ordinary. Farming communities, so you continue with the methods that have served your people for generations, knowing that this is the way things have always been done and likely always will be done. But as you work, grinding grain into flour, grain by grain, stroke by stroke, you cannot help but wonder, what would it be like to live in a world where this work could be done more easily? What would you do with your mornings if you did not have to spend them hunched over a grinding stone? What other tasks could you accomplish? What other skills could you develop? The daily burden of grain processing required less of your time and energy. These are dangerous thoughts, perhaps, but they persist as you work, providing a kind of mental escape from the monotony of the grinding rhythm. And as the morning progresses toward noon and the work continues with its relentless demands, you begin to think about the larger questions. How long can this system continue? What happens when the population grows too large for the current methods to feed? What innovations might eventually emerge to change the way grain is processed? The sun reaches its zenith as you finally complete the morning's grinding. 6 cups of barley and emmer wheat have been transformed into a coarse meal that will feed your family for the day. Your hands are stiff and sore, your back aches with the familiar deep pain of overworked muscles, and your knees will be tender for hours. But you have succeeded in the most fundamental task of survival. You have created food from grain, nourishment from raw materials, sustenance from the earth's bounty. As you carefully gather the precious flour into storage jars, you think about your grandmother's stories. She used to describe a time when the work was somehow more meaningful, when women would gather together for grinding sessions that were as much social occasions as work periods. Groups of women would sit in courtyards, their grinding stones arranged in circles, singing work songs and sharing gossip as they processed grain together. You have experienced these communal grinding sessions yourself, particularly during harvest, time when the entire village works together to process the new crop. There is something almost hypnotic about the synchronized rhythm of 20 or 30 saddle corns operating together, the sound of the handstones scraping against the granite bases, creating a complex percussion that seems to echo the heartbeat of the community itself. During these sessions, the older women share their knowledge with the younger ones, passing down not just the techniques of efficient grinding, but the cultural traditions that have grown up around this essential work. They teach the proper songs that help maintain rhythm and reduce fatigue. They demonstrate the subtle adjustments in technique that can increase efficiency or reduce wear on the grinding stones. They share remedies for the common injuries and ailments that plague women who spend their lives at the quern. But more than technical knowledge, these sessions pass down the stories that give meaning to the work. Stories about the goddess Neith, who first taught humans to grind grain and who watches over women's work. Stories about the sacred nature of bread, which connects the earth's fertility to human survival. Stories about the ancient queens who were said to be so skilled at grinding that they could produce flour finer than sand. Flour so pure that it was reserved for offerings to the gods. These stories matter because they transform the daily grinding from mere drudgery into something larger, something connected to the cosmic order. When you lean into the handstone and feel the grain crush beneath it, you are participating in a ritual that extends back to the beginning of civilization itself. You are continuing the work that has sustained every Egyptian who has ever lived, from the pharaohs in their palaces to the peasants in their mud brick houses. But the stories also carry darker truths. The work songs that help maintain rhythm often contain verses about the physical toll of grinding, about the women who died young from the constant strain, about the deformities that mark the bodies of those who have spent their lives at the quern. These are not complaints, exactly, but acknowledgments of the price that must be paid for survival. You have seen this price in your own body and in the bodies of the women around you. Your mother, now in her 40th year, can no longer grind for more than an hour at a time before her back forces her to rest. Your older sister developed a persistent cough from breathing grain dust that never seems to go away completely. The village's oldest woman, revered for her wisdom and skill, has hands so gnarled with arthritis that she can barely hold a handstone, though she continues to supervise the younger women's work. And yet, despite the physical cost, despite the endless repetition, despite the sheer magnitude of time that this work consumes, you cannot imagine a world without it. The grinding of grain is not just an economic necessity, but a fundamental part of what it means to be human. It is the transformation of nature into culture, of raw materials into sustenance, of individual effort into community survival. As the afternoon progresses and you turn to other tasks, tending the small garden behind your house, preparing the midday meal, caring for your youngest child, you find yourself thinking about the future. Your daughter will soon be old enough to begin learning the techniques of grinding. Your son will grow up expecting that bread will appear on the table each day, made possible by his mother's and sister's labor at the quern. The system seems as permanent as the Nile itself, as unchanging as the cycle of flood and harvest that governs Egyptian life. And yet, you have heard whispers of changes coming. Travelers speak of new techniques being developed in the great cities, of experiments with different types of grinding equipment, of innovations that might make the work more efficient. Some of these changes are already visible in your own village. The grinding stones themselves have improved over the years as the stoneworkers have learned to create more effective surfaces for crushing grain. The storage methods have evolved, reducing the loss of grain to insects and rodents and making it possible to keep flour fresh for longer periods. Even the work techniques have been refined as women have discovered more efficient ways to use their bodies and minimize fatigue. But the fundamental nature of the work remains unchanged. A woman kneels before a grinding stone, applies pressure with her arms and shoulders, and slowly transforms grain into flour through the application of human muscle power. This is the way it has always been done, and it seems to be the way it will always be done as evening approaches and you prepare the bread that will feed your family. You reflect on the strange paradox of your daily life. The work that consumes so much of your time and energy is simultaneously the most tedious and the most essential task you perform. It is boring in its repetition, exhausting in its physical demands, and yet absolutely crucial for survival. This bread, made from flour ground with your own hands, processed grain by grain through hours of patient labor, represents the foundation upon which all of Egyptian civilization rests. The pyramids could not have been built without it. The temples, could not have been maintained without it. The armies could not have marched without it. The pharaohs could not have ruled without it. And tomorrow, you will wake before dawn and begin the process again. Another day, another batch of grain to be ground. Another small victory against hunger and chaos. The work will continue as it has for generations, as it must for generations. Yet to come, until perhaps someday someone discovers a better way to turn grain into gruel. But for now, in this moment, in this place, in this time, you are the keeper of civilization's most essential skill. You are the woman who grinds the grain, who makes the bread, who ensures that life continues. It is boring, yes. It is exhausting, certainly. But it is also, in its own quiet way, heroic. The sun sets over the Nile, casting long shadows across the village, as women throughout the community complete their daily grinding and begin preparing the evening meal. And in that fading light, with the sound of grinding stones finally silent after another day's work, you can almost imagine that this rhythm will continue forever, as eternal and reliable as the river itself. You stand at the edge of the village of Little Wickham in the year 1347, watching the water wheel turn with its ancient, hypnotic rhythm. The wheel is massive, nearly 20 feet in diameter, and its slow revolution powers the grinding stones. That will process grain for every soul in this community of perhaps 300 people. As the miller's apprentice, you have been watching this wheel turn for 3 years now. And yet you still find something both magnificent and ominous about its ceaseless motion. Your name is Thomas. And at 15 years old, you are already marked as different from the other young men in the village. While they work in the fields with their fathers, learning the rhythm of planting and harvest, you have been chosen, or perhaps cursed, to learn the mysteries of the mill. The other boys regard you with a mixture of envy and suspicion. Envy, because the miller's trade is profitable, because it offers a chance to escape the back-breaking labor of farming. Suspicion, because millers, as everyone knows, are not to be trusted. Master Geoffrey, the miller, who has taken you as his apprentice, is a man in his 40th year, thick-bodied and flour-dusted, with the permanently stained hands and clothing that mark his profession. He has run this mill for nearly 20 years, inheriting it from his father, who inherited it from his father before him. The mill is not just his livelihood, but his identity, his place in the intricate web of obligations and relationships that define medieval village life. The mill building itself is a testament to the ingenuity and craftsmanship of an earlier age. Built of local stone and heavy timber, it straddles the stream with 1 foot on each bank, allowing the water to flow beneath the massive wheel. The grinding chamber is on the upper floor, reached by a steep wooden staircase that groans under. The weight of grain sacks carried up and flour sacks carried down. Everything about the structure speaks of permanence, of a system designed to last for generations. But permanence comes with a price, and that price is the complex relationship between the miller and the community he serves. Master Geoffrey does not own this mill in the way a farmer owns his plow or a carpenter owns his tools. The mill belongs to Sir Robert de Montfort, the lord of the manor, and Geoffrey operates it under terms that bind him as surely as any serf is bound to the soil he cannot leave. He cannot refuse to serve any villager who brings grain to be ground. He cannot set his own prices or establish his own rules of operation in exchange for these restrictions. Geoffrey holds a monopoly. Every grain of wheat, barley, rye, and oats grown in Little Wickham and the surrounding hamlets must be brought to this mill to be ground. No one may operate a hand corn in their home, no matter how small the quantity of grain or how urgent the need. This is the law, enforced by the manor court and backed by the Lord's authority. It is a law that makes Geoffrey prosperous, but also makes him the target of endless resentment and suspicion. The mill operates on a system of tolls that has been unchanged for generations. Geoffrey keeps a portion of every grain brought to be. Ground usually 1/16 of the total, though the exact amount varies depending on the type of grain and the season. This toll, called multure, is his payment for the grinding service. But it is also the source of constant friction with the villagers. Every morning brings a stream of farmers and their wives, carrying sacks of grain that represent weeks or months of labor in the fields. They arrive with careful mental calculations of exactly how much grain they are bringing and how much flour they expect to receive in return. They watch Jeffrey's every movement as he operates the scales, weighing their grain with a suspicious attention that never diminishes. No matter how many times they have made this same transaction, and Jeffrey, for his part, has learned to conduct his business under this constant scrutiny with a combination of professional competence and defensive wariness. He knows that every villager believes he is being cheated, that every transaction is viewed as an opportunity for the miller to enrich himself at their expense. He has developed the thick skin necessary to ignore the muttered comments and sideways glances. But the constant atmosphere of distrust weighs on him. Nonetheless, the actual process of grinding is a complex dance between man and machine that requires years to master. The heart of the mill is the pair of grinding stones, massive circular stones, each weighing over a ton, that must be perfectly balanced and precisely aligned to produce good flour without destroying themselves through excessive friction. The lower stone, called the bedstone, is fixed in position. The upper stone, called the runner, rotates above it, driven by the water wheel through a complex system of gears and shafts. The space between the stones, measured in fractions of an inch, determines the fineness of the flour. Too much space and the grain is merely cracked, not ground. Too little space and the stones bind together, potentially destroying both the grain and the stones themselves. Adjusting this gap requires a delicate touch and years of experience, and it must be done constantly as the stones wear and the grain moisture content changes throughout the day. You have been learning to make these adjustments under Master Jeffrey's watchful eye, and you are beginning to understand why the miller's trade is both respected and feared. The knowledge required to operate a mill successfully cannot be learned from books. There are no books in Little Wickham in any case, but must be passed down through apprenticeship. Master to student, generation by generation. This knowledge represents power, and power always generates suspicion. The grain is fed into the eye of the upper stone through a wooden hopper suspended above the grinding chamber. A wooden shoe, connected to the stone assembly, vibrates with a rotation and feeds grain steadily into the eye. Too much grain and the stones bind. It's little and they spin uselessly, heating up from friction and potentially cracking. The miller must monitor the feed rate constantly, adjusting it by ear as much as by sight, listening to the subtle changes in the sound of the grinding that indicate when adjustments are needed. The flour emerges from between the stones and is collected in wooden bins around the perimeter of the grinding chamber. Different grades of flour are produced by varying the gap between the stones and by sifting the ground grain through cloths of different weaves. The finest white flour, produced by the closest stone setting and the most careful sifting, is reserved for the Lord's table and the wealthiest villagers. Coarser meals, containing more bran and germ, make up the bulk of the miller's output and the staple food of the common people. As Master Jeffrey guides you through the day's work, he explains the economics of the mill with the resigned cynicism of a man who has spent his life in a profitable but despised profession. The mill must be maintained constantly, the water wheel repaired, the gears greased, the stones dressed and balanced. These tasks require specialized knowledge and expensive materials, costs that must be recovered through the multure toll. But every expense, every repair, every improvement is viewed by the villagers as evidence of the miller's greed and dishonesty. The seasonal rhythm of the mill follows the agricultural calendar of the village. During harvest time, the mill operates from dawn to dusk, processing the flood of new grain that will sustain the community through the coming year. The work is intense and exhausting, with barely time to rest between loads. Jeffrey's wife and children are pressed into service, helping to carry grain and flour, to tend the machinery, to maintain the careful records that track each farmer's account. Winter brings its own challenges, as the stream freezes and the water flow becomes unreliable. The mill may stand idle for days at a time, while grain waits to be ground and villagers grow impatient. Spring floods can damage the wheel and the mill structure, requiring expensive repairs that cut into the year's profits. Summer droughts can reduce the water flow to a trickle, forcing the mill to operate at reduced capacity just when the demand for fresh flour is highest. Through all these seasonal variations, Master Jeffrey must maintain his relationships with the villagers, while protecting his own interests and those of his family. He must be fair enough to avoid serious complaints to the manor court, but profitable enough to support his household and pay his obligations to the Lord. He must be skilled enough to produce good flour consistently, but not so obviously prosperous as to attract accusations of excessive profiteering. And underlying all these practical considerations is the deeper suspicion that has always surrounded the medieval miller's trade. In a society where most people work with their hands, farming, crafting, building, the miller's work seems almost magical. He takes grain and transforms it into flour through processes that appear to operate themselves, powered by the mysterious force of flowing water. He controls a monopoly granted by the Lord, a privilege that sets him apart from the common villagers. He handles every family's grain, knowing their stores, their prosperity, their vulnerability. This combination of apparent magical power, economic privilege, and intimate knowledge of community resources makes the miller a figure of both necessity and suspicion. He is essential to the village's survival, but he is also an outsider, a man whose interests are not entirely aligned with those of his customers. The very structure of his trade creates conflicts that cannot be resolved through good intentions or fair dealing alone. As the afternoon progresses and you help Master Jeffrey process load after load of grain, you begin to understand the peculiar isolation of the miller's position. You are part of the village community, but separate from it. You are prosperous compared to most of the farmers, but dependent on their goodwill and custom. You possess specialized knowledge that gives you power, but that same knowledge marks you as different, potentially dangerous, and lurking beneath. All these tensions is the fundamental question that will define your adult life, in a world where survival depends on grain. And grain must be processed to be useful. Who should control the process? The farmers who grow the grain, the lord who owns the land, the miller who operates the machinery, or the community as a whole, whose survival depends on the efficient functioning of the system? These are not questions that will be answered easily, if they can be answered at all. But they are questions that every miller must face every day, as he stands between the grinding stones and the villagers who depend on his work, trying to balance the competing demands of profit, duty, and survival. In a world where grain is life and the power to process grain is the power to determine who lives and who dies. Dawn breaks gray and cold over Little Wickham, and Master Jeffrey's mood matches the weather. During the night, someone has thrown stones at the mill's shutters, not enough to cause serious damage, but enough to send a message. This is the third such incident in the past month, and Jeffrey knows it will not be the last. The harvest has been poor. Winter is coming early. And when people are hungry, they look for someone to blame. You help him inspect the damage as the first customers of the day begin to arrive. Dame Marjorie, the baker's wife, carries a small sack of rye that will be transformed into the dark bread that feeds the village's poorest families. Behind her, young William Shepherd struggles under the weight of a grain sack that represents his family's seed for next spring's planting. Grain that must be carefully processed to preserve its viability while making it suitable for immediate consumption as you begin the day's work. Jeffrey explains the delicate calculations that govern every aspect of the milling business. The mulcher toll that he collects is not simply profit, must cover the costs of maintaining the mill, paying taxes to the Lord, supporting his family, and accumulating reserves for the inevitable repairs and replacements that keep the operation running. But try explaining this to a farmer whose family is facing a hungry winter, who sees the miller's flour-dusted prosperity as evidence of theft and exploitation. The grinding stones themselves embody this tension between necessity and suspicion. These massive millstones represent a significant investment. They must be quarried from specific types of rock, transported at enormous expense, and shaped by craftsmen whose skills are as rare as they are essential. A good pair of stones can last 20 years or more with proper care, but they require constant attention and periodic dressing to maintain their grinding surfaces. The dressing of millstones is an art that few understand and fewer can perform competently. The grinding surface of each stone is covered with carefully cut grooves that must be maintained at precisely the right depth and angle to ensure efficient grinding. Too shallow and the grain is not properly broken down. Too deep, and the flour is contaminated with stone dust. The pattern of grooves must be designed to move grain from the center of the stone to the outer edge, creating the circulation necessary for even grinding. Master Jeffrey has been teaching you this skill with the patient intensity of a man passing on knowledge that cannot be found in any book. You work together in the pre-dawn hours when the mill is quiet and the grinding stones are still, using hammer and chisel to carefully reshape the worn grooves. The work is slow and meticulous. Single misplaced blow can ruin a stone worth more than most villagers will earn in a year. But even this essential maintenance becomes a source of suspicion. When the mill is shut down for stone dressing, farmers must wait longer to have their grain processed. They see the closed mill as evidence of the miller's laziness or incompetence rather than understanding the necessity of the work being performed. The specialized tools required for stone dressing, the imported steel chisels and precision hammers, are viewed as symbols of the miller's excessive wealth rather than necessary implements of his trade. The social dynamics of the mill reflect and amplify the broader tensions of medieval village life. Master Jeffrey occupies a position that is simultaneously central and marginal to the community. His work is essential without the mill. The village would face starvation within weeks. But his monopoly privileges granted by the Lord rather than earned through community consensus set him apart from the other tradesmen and craftsmen who serve the village. Unlike the blacksmith, whose skills are clearly visible and whose charges are negotiated for each job, the miller's toll is fixed by custom and law. Unlike the carpenter, who works with materials provided by his customers, the miller handles grain that belongs to others and returns flour that is somehow diminished in quantity, even if improved in quality. Unlike the baker, who transforms flour into bread through his own labor and skill, the miller's work appears to be performed by the machinery itself, with little visible human contribution. These perceptions, however unfair, shape every interaction between Master Jeffrey and his customers. When Dame Marjorie brings her rye to be ground, she watches Jeffrey's every movement with the intensity of a woman who has calculated exactly how much flour she expects to receive. She has weighed the grain herself, estimated the toll that will be deducted, and planned the loaves that will result from the transaction. Any discrepancy, however small, becomes evidence of the miller's dishonesty. Jeffrey, for his part, has developed the methodical precision of a man who knows he is being watched and judged. He weighs each load of grain twice, announces the weight aloud, and carefully measures the toll in full view of his customers. He maintains detailed records of every transaction, though few of his customers can read the marks he makes in his ledger book. These precautions protect him from accusations of cheating, But they also reinforce the atmosphere of distrust that surrounds every transaction. The seasonal rhythm of suspicion follows the agricultural calendar. During harvest time, when grain is plentiful and the future seems secure, the villagers are more willing to accept the miller's toll as a necessary cost of processing their crops. But as winter deepens and stored grain diminishes, every handful of flour becomes precious. And the miller's share seems increasingly excessive. Spring brings its own tensions. As families calculate whether their remaining grain will last until the next harvest, the miller, with his detailed knowledge of every family's grain stores, becomes a repository of uncomfortable truths about the village's food security. He knows which families are facing genuine hunger, which have hidden reserves, which are selling grain they cannot afford to lose. This knowledge makes him valuable to the lord of the manor, who relies on the miller's reports to assess taxes and obligations. But it also makes him a target for the resentment of those whose secrets he knows. The technical challenges of milling add another layer of complexity to these social tensions. Master Geoffrey must constantly balance the competing demands of quality and quantity, speed and care, customer satisfaction and profitability. The gap between the grinding stones must be adjusted for different types of grain. Different moisture contents, different quality requirements. Wheat requires a different setting than barley. Damp grain from a wet harvest grinds differently than grain that has been stored through a dry winter. These adjustments require split-second timing and years of experience to master. You are beginning to develop the ear for the subtle changes in the grinding sound that indicate when the stones need adjustment. But Geoffrey can detect variations that remain completely inaudible to you. He can tell by the color and texture of the emerging flour whether the stones are properly aligned, whether the grain feed rate is correct, whether the grinding is proceeding efficiently. But this expertise, as essential as it is to producing good flour, is largely invisible to the customers who bring their grain to be ground. They see the grain go into the hopper and the flour emerge from the bins, but they cannot appreciate the constant micro-adjustments that make this transformation possible. The miller's skill appears to be effortless, automatic, perhaps even magic land. Magic, in the medieval world, it's always suspect. The afternoon brings news that will test every aspect of Geoffrey's relationship with the village. A merchant from the market town of Great Wickham has arrived with word that grain prices have risen sharply due to poor harvests throughout the region. This news means different things to different people. Opportunity for those with grain to sell, disaster for those who must buy grain to survive, and complication for the miller who must navigate between these competing interests. For Geoffrey, rising grain prices create a paradox. His toll is calculated as a proportion of the grain processed, so higher grain values should mean higher income. But higher prices also mean that villagers have less money to spend on having their grain ground, and they become even more suspicious of the miller's charges. Some families may choose to eat their grain as porridge rather than pay to have it ground into flour for bread, reducing the mill's business just when it should be most profitable. The merchant also brings rumors of unrest in other villages. Stories of mills attacked and millers driven out by hungry crowds convinced that their suffering is caused by the greed of those who control the grain supply. These stories are not uncommon during times of scarcity, and they serve as a reminder of the precarious position that millers occupy in the social order. As evening approaches and the day's work winds down, Master Geoffrey shares with you the wisdom that his father passed to him and that he now passes to you. A miller must be many things to many people, but above all, he must be survivor. He must be skilled enough to produce good flour consistently, honest enough to avoid serious legal trouble, diplomatic enough to manage the endless complaints and suspicions of his customers, and tough enough to withstand the social isolation that comes with his profession. The mill's water wheel continues its slow revolution in the gathering darkness. a mechanical heartbeat that has marked the passage of time in Little Wickham for generations. But how much longer can this system continue? What happens when the tensions between miller and village become too great to manage? And what alternatives might emerge to challenge the ancient monopoly that has both sustained and cursed the millers? Trade for centuries. The year 1348 brings changes to Little Wickham that no one could have anticipated. Changes that will test the very foundations of the medieval milling system. The great mortality, what future generations will call the Black. Death has reached England, and its effects ripple through every aspect of village life. Master Geoffrey has survived the plague, but nearly a third of the village has not, including Sir Robert de Montfort, the lord of the manor whose authority has governed the mill for generations. You have now been Geoffrey's apprentice for 4 years, and at 19 you are old enough to understand the implications of these changes. The new lord, Sir Robert's nephew William, is young and uncertain, more interested in his holdings in France than in the daily governance of an English village. The manor court, which has traditionally resolved disputes between millers and villagers, meets irregularly and with less authority than before. The careful balance of obligations and privileges that has sustained the milling monopoly for centuries is beginning to shift. The immediate effect is visible in the changed behavior of Geoffrey's customers. Where once they brought their grain to the mill with resigned acceptance of the established system, now they arrive with new questions and demands. Why must all grain be ground at this mill? Why cannot families process small amounts of grain at home, as their ancestors did? Why should the miller's toll remain fixed when so many other aspects of village life are changing? These questions reflect deeper changes in the social structure of medieval England. The plague has created labor shortages that give surviving peasants new bargaining power with their lords. Traditional obligations are being renegotiated or simply abandoned. Young men who once would have been bound to the soil for life are leaving to seek better opportunities in towns and cities. The rigid hierarchy that has defined rural life for generations is beginning to crack. Master Geoffrey responds to these challenges with the conservative instincts of a man whose prosperity depends on maintaining the status quo. He cites ancient customs, refers to agreements made by previous generations, appeals to the authority of lords and laws that seem increasingly distant and irrelevant. But his customers are no longer impressed by these appeals to tradition. They have seen too much change, survived too much catastrophe, to accept the old answers to new questions. The technical aspects of milling, however, remain unchanged by social upheaval. The grinding stones still require constant maintenance. The water wheel still demands regular repairs. The complex machinery of the mill still needs the expert knowledge that Geoffrey has spent a lifetime acquiring. These practical realities provide a counterpoint to the social tensions. Surrounding the mill's operations, you have become proficient in most aspects of the milling trade, capable of operating the mill independently for short periods while Geoffrey attends to other business. This growing competence has given you new insights into the relationship between technical skill and social power. The mill's monopoly is not sustained solely by legal privilege. It is also protected by the genuine difficulty of grain processing and the specialized knowledge required to do it efficiently. When villagers complain about having to bring their grain to the mill, they rarely acknowledge the alternative. Hand grinding grain with cornstones is possible, as their ancestors demonstrated for centuries, but it is slow, laborious work that produces inferior results. A family grinding grain at home might spend hours each day processing enough flour for their daily bread, time that could be spent on other essential tasks. The mill's efficiency, whatever its social costs, represents genuine value that cannot be easily replaced. But efficiency alone is no longer sufficient to justify the miller's privileged position. The villagers have begun to organize themselves. into informal groups that coordinate their visits to the mill, share information about the quality of grinding, and present collective complaints about Jeffrey's practices. These groups represent a new form of customer power that challenges the traditional relationship between Aquila and community. The most serious challenge comes from an unexpected source: Master John the carpenter, whose skills in working with wood and understanding mechanical systems make him a potential competitor in the milling trade. John has begun talking about constructing a second mill on a different part of the stream, using his carpentry skills to create machinery that could compete with Jeffrey's monopoly. This proposal terrifies Jeffrey in ways that customer complaints never could. A competing mill would destroy the economic foundation of his trade, forcing him to compete on price and service rather than relying on legal privilege. But the proposal also excites some villagers who see it as an opportunity to break free from the traditional system that has bound them to a single miller for generations. The debate over John's proposed mill brings into focus all the tensions that have been building around the milling trade. Jeffrey argues that competition would be wasteful, that the village cannot support two mills, that dividing the grain supply would make both operations less efficient. He points out that mill construction requires significant investment, specialized knowledge, and ongoing maintenance that John may not fully understand. John counters that competition would improve service and reduce costs, that Jeffrey's monopoly has made him complacent and greedy, that the village deserves alternatives to the current system. He promises that his mill would operate on different principles, charging fixed fees rather than taking a percentage of grain, operating according to schedules negotiated with customers rather than imposed by the miller. The technical feasibility of John's proposal becomes a subject of intense village debate. Jeffrey, with his detailed knowledge of milling machinery, can point to dozens of potential problems with John's designs: the positioning of the water wheel, the design of the gear, train, the construction of the grinding stones. All of these require expertise that John, for all his carpentry skills, does not possess. But John's proposal is not really about technical feasibility, it's about the principle of choice. The villagers who support him are not necessarily convinced that he can build a better mill, but they are attracted to the idea of having options, of being able to choose between different millers based on their performance rather than being bound to a single operator by law and custom. As the debate intensifies, you find yourself caught between your loyalty to Master Jeffrey and your understanding of the villagers' grievances. Jeffrey has been a good master, teaching you valuable skills and treating you fairly. But you have also witnessed the daily frictions of the milling trade, the constant atmosphere of suspicion and resentment that surrounds every transaction. The resolution of this conflict comes not through village debate, but through external intervention. The new lord, Sir William, finally asserts his authority by forbidding the construction of any competing mill. His decision is based not on an assessment of the technical or economic merits of the proposal, but on his desire to preserve the traditional sources of manor income, including the taxes and fees paid by the existing mill. This intervention temporarily preserves Jeffrey's monopoly, but it also demonstrates the fragility of the system that protects it. The miller's privileged position depends ultimately on the authority of lords whose interests may not align with either the miller's prosperity or the village's welfare. When that authority is weak or distracted, as it increasingly is in the changing world of the 14th century, the entire system becomes vulnerable. The failed challenge to Jeffrey's monopoly leaves lasting changes in the relationship between the mill and the village. The customers who supported John's proposal continue to bring their grain to be ground, but they do so with obvious reluctance and increased suspicion. Jeffrey's authority as the village miller remains legally intact, but his moral authority, his acceptance by the community as a legitimate and necessary part of village life has been permanently damaged. You observe these changes with the mixed feelings of someone whose future is bound up with an institution under siege. The milling trade still offers opportunities for prosperity and social advancement that are rare in the medieval world. The skills you have learned are valuable, and portable mills exist in every agricultural community. And experienced millers are always in demand. But the social cost of the profession seems to be rising, and the traditional justifications for the miller's privileged position are being questioned as never before. As 1348 draws to a close, Master Geoffrey begins to speak more frequently about retirement, about passing the mill to you or to another successor, about finding a way to escape the pressures that have made his life increasingly difficult. These conversations force you to confront the question of whether you want to inherit not just the mill's technical operations, but also its social burdens. The mill's water wheel continues its eternal rotation, grinding grain into flour as it has for generations and as it will for generations to come. But the world around the mill is changing in ways that will ultimately transform the entire milling trade. The monopolies that have protected millers for centuries are beginning to crumble. The social deference that has made their privileged position tolerable is giving way to new demands for choice and competition. And somewhere in this changing world, new forms of grain processing are being developed that will eventually make the village mill as obsolete as the hand corn it once replaced. But for now, in this moment, in this place, you stand between the grinding stones and wonder, what does the future hold for those who turn grain into gruel? And when the old system finally collapses, what will take its place? The questions hang in the air like flour dust settling slowly into the corners of the mill, waiting for answers that will not come for generations yet unborn. Your name is Marcus, though that name was given to you by your master, not your parents. You do not remember your parents. You were perhaps 5 years old when the slave traders took you from some village in Gaul whose name you have forgotten, sold into bondage to help satisfy Rome's endless appetite for human labor. Now, at 23, you have spent more of your life in chains than free. And the mill where you work has become both your prison and your entire world. The bakery mill of Lucius, Crassus Fortunatus, occupies a prime location on the Via dell'Abbondanza. In Pompeii, its stone facade presenting a respectable front to the street. Customers entering the front shop see clean counters, fresh bread, and a prosperous merchant conducting business with the dignity appropriate to his station. They do not see the grinding chamber behind the shop, where you and 11 other slaves spend your days in conditions that would shock even the hardened citizens of Rome. The grinding chamber is perhaps 30 feet square, with thick stone walls that rise to a height of barely 8 feet. Small windows near the ceiling provide minimal light and ventilation, but they are barred with iron grates that serve a double purpose. They prevent escape while allowing just enough air circulation to keep the workers alive. The floor is packed earth, stained dark with grain dust, sweat, and the occasional drops of blood from workers injured by the massive damned machinery. The heart of the chamber contains 4 grinding mills, each consisting of 2 enormous stones that together weigh more than a ton. The lower stone, called the meta, is conical and fixed in position. The upper stone, the catalyst, is hollow and sits over the meta like a massive hourglass. Grain is poured into the top of the catalyst and ground between the stones as the upper stone rotates around the lower one. But these stones do not turn by magic or mechanical convenience. They turn because you and your fellow slaves, along with 3 donkeys who share your confinement, provide the motive power that drives the grinding process. Wooden posts extend horizontally from each catalyst, and for 12 hours each day, you push against these posts, walking in endless circles around the grinding stones, your bare feet wearing paths in the earth floor that have been worn by previous generations of slaves. The work begins before dawn, when the overseer, a freedman named Gaius, who once worked as a slave in this same mill, unlocks the chamber, and counts heads to ensure that no one has escaped during the night. Escape is virtually impossible. The few windows are barred. The single door is locked from the outside. Now the walls are too thick to break through, but the count is performed anyway. A ritual assertion of control that sets the tone for the day ahead. You are chained to your grinding mill by a short length of iron that allows you to walk in a circle around the stones, but prevents you from reaching the other mills or the walls of the chamber. The chain is attached to a metal collar around your neck, a collar that has worn a permanent groove in your skin and that marks you as clearly as any brand as a slave whose life has been reduced to this single repetitive function. The donkeys that share your workspace are similarly restrained, though their treatment is in some ways more humane than yours. The animals are blindfolded to prevent them from becoming dizzy as they walk in circles, and they are allowed regular rest periods to prevent them from collapsing from exhaustion. You and your fellow slaves are given no such consideration. You can see the futility of your situation with perfect clarity, and you are expected to maintain the grinding pace from dawn to dusk with only brief pauses for water and the thin gruel that constitutes your daily ration. The grain processed in this mill comes from estates throughout the Roman Empire. Wheat from Egypt, barley from Gaul, rye from Germania. Of it flows through Pompey's port and into the grinding chambers where slave labor transforms it into the flour that feeds the city's 40,000 inhabitants. The scale of the operation is staggering. Your mill alone processes several tons of grain each day, and there are dozens of similar mills throughout the city. The technical process of grinding is simple in concept but demanding in execution. Grain is poured into the top of the catalyst through a central opening, then works its way down between the two stones as they rotate. The gap between the stones determines the fineness of the flour. Too wide, and the grain is merely cracked; too narrow, and the stones bind together and stop rotating. Maintaining the proper gap requires constant attention from the overseer, who adjusts the stones using wooden wedges and metal tools. As you push against the wooden beam that extends from your grinding stone, you feel the resistance that indicates grain is being processed effectively. When the grinding is going well, the beam moves steadily but not easily, requiring continuous pressure but not overwhelming force. When problems develop, if too much grain is fed into the mill, or if the stones become misaligned, the resistance increases dramatically, and you must strain against the beam with all your strength just to keep it moving. The physical demands of this work are brutal and unrelenting. Walking in circles for 12 hours while pushing against a heavy resistance is exhausting under any circumstances. But the conditions in the grinding chamber make it far worse. The air is thick with flour dust that clogs your lungs and burns your eyes. The temperature, even in winter, is stifling due to the friction generated by the grinding stones and the body heat of workers and animals. Confined in a small space, you're clothing a single rough tunic that is replaced perhaps once a year, becomes caked with flour, dust, and sweat until it forms a rigid shell that chafes your skin with every movement. Your feet bare because shoes would quickly be destroyed by the constant walking. Develop thick calluses that crack and bleed on the rough ground. Your hands, gripping the wooden beam hour after hour, are permanently curved into claws and covered with blisters that never have time to heal. But the physical discomfort is only part of the grinding mill's horror. The psychological effects of the work may be even more damaging. The endless circular motion, the repetitive pushing, the constant noise of grinding stones and groaning machinery create a form of sensory torture that breaks down the human spirit as effectively as it breaks down grain. Many slaves develop a vacant stare, a mental absence that allows them to endure the work. By divorcing their consciousness from their physical experience, you have not yet reached this stage of mental retreat, perhaps because your natural intelligence rebels against the pointless brutality of your situation. You understand that the flour you are grinding will be baked into bread that will sell for prices that could buy your freedom many times over. You calculate the value of your daily labor and compare it to the cost of your food and shelter. You know that your master profits enormously from your suffering, and this knowledge feeds a rage that keeps you alert and engaged with the world around you. The social dynamics among the slaves in the grinding chamber are complex and often brutal. Competition for the easiest grinding positions for extra food, for the overseer's favor, creates tensions that sometimes explode into violence. Some slaves have been here so long that they have developed a twisted loyalty to the system, becoming informants who report on escape plans or resistance activities in exchange for minor privileges. Others, like yourself, maintain a desperate hope for freedom and spend their few moments of rest discussing escape plans that everyone knows are impossible. The mill operates in the heart of a busy city, surrounded by free citizens who would immediately report any escaped slave. Even if you could somehow leave the building, where would you go? You have no money, no friends outside the mill, no knowledge of the world beyond Pompeii's walls. The presence of the donkeys in the grinding chamber adds another layer of degradation to your situation. You work alongside animals performing the same function they perform, treated with no more consideration than they receive. The symbolism is deliberate and crushing. You have been reduced to the level of beasts of burden, valuable only for the labor power that can be extracted from your body. As the morning progresses and the grinding continues, you think about the customers who will eventually consume the bread made from your flour. Roman citizens enjoying their morning meals, wealthy merchants entertaining guests, soldiers preparing for campaigns, all of them sustained by grain processed through your labor. They give no thought to the slaves who make their bread possible, no consideration to the human cost of their daily sustenance. The overseer, Gaius, watches the grinding operation with the practiced eye of someone who has spent years learning to extract maximum productivity from slave labor. He knows exactly how much grain each mill should process per hour, can tell by the sound of the stones whether the grinding is proceeding efficiently, understands the subtle signs that indicate when a slave is approaching collapse and needs to be replaced. Gaius was once a slave himself, chained to these same grinding stones, walking these same circular paths. His promotion to overseer is presented as evidence that the system can reward good behavior and loyal service. But you know that his freedom is as illusory as his authority. He remains dependent on his master's goodwill, subject to punishment. If productivity declines, liable to be returned to slave status. If he fails to maintain discipline among the workers, this knowledge shapes your relationship with Gaius in complex ways. You hate him for his role in perpetuating your suffering, but you also understand that he is as trapped as you are, caught between the demands of his master and the resistance of the slaves he supervises. His cruelty toward the slaves under his authority is partly a performance, a demonstration of loyalty to his master that he hopes will protect his own precarious position. As midday approaches and the heat in the grinding chamber becomes almost unbearable, you begin to understand something that will haunt you for the rest of your life. This is not temporary suffering that you must endure until circumstances change. This is your life, your entire existence, your purpose as defined by Roman society. You will walk these circles, push against this beam, breathe this dust-laden air until your body fails and you are replaced by another slave who will take up the same endless task. The grinding stones continue their slow rotation, processing grain into flour, as they have for decades and as they will for decades to come. But somewhere in your mind, despite the despair and exhaustion, a question forms. How long can such a system continue? What happens when the cost of maintaining slave labor exceeds its benefits? And what alternatives might emerge to challenge the fundamental assumption that human beings can be reduced to mechanical components in a grain processing system? These are dangerous thoughts for a slave to entertain, but they persist as you push against the beam and feel the resistance of grain being crushed between stones. And in that resistance, that endless grinding pressure, you sense something larger. The forces that will eventually transform not just the milling trade, but the entire economic system that depends on slave labor to turn grain into gruel. The afternoon shift begins with a ritual that has remained unchanged for as long as anyone can remember. Gaius unlocks a wooden chest and removes a leather whip, which he places prominently on a shelf where all the slaves can see it. This whip is rarely used. The overseer has learned that the threat of violence is often more effective than violence itself. But its presence serves as a constant reminder of the consequences of defiance or inadequate performance. You have been working the grinding mill for 6 years now, long enough to understand the intricate economics that govern your existence. The mill of Lucius Crassus Fortunatus is not simply a place where grain is processed. It is a carefully calculated system for extracting maximum value from human labor while minimizing the costs of maintaining that labor force. Every aspect of your daily routine has been designed to optimize this economic equation. The physical layout of the grinding chamber reflects this optimization. The mills are positioned to allow the overseer to observe all workers simultaneously while remaining safely distant from any potential violence. The chains that bind you to your grinding station are exactly long enough to allow efficient work while preventing cooperation with slaves at other mills. The height of the ceiling is calculated to provide adequate ventilation while making escape through the windows impossible. Even your diet has been precisely calibrated to maintain your capacity for labor while minimizing food costs. The daily ration consists of a thin gruel made from the coarsest flour, occasionally supplemented with small amounts of wine or olive oil. This diet provides just enough nutrition to keep you functioning, but not enough to maintain optimal health. Your body has adapted to this chronic malnutrition by becoming lean and wiry, efficient at extracting energy from minimal food, but vulnerable to illness and injury. The work itself has been broken down into components that can be precisely measured and controlled. Each grinding mill is expected to process a specific quantity of grain per hour, and Gaius tracks this production with the dedication of a military commander managing supplies. He knows that Mill 1 typically produces 12 amphora flour per day. That Mill 2 tends to run slightly slower due to worn grinding stones. That Mill 3 requires careful monitoring because the slave assigned to it has been showing signs of resistance. You have been assigned to Mill 4, which is considered the most demanding position because it processes the hardest grains, wheat and barley, that require maximum pressure to grind effectively. This assignment is both punishment and recognition. Punishment because you have never fully accepted your enslavement. Recognition because you are strong enough to maintain productivity despite the additional physical demands. The grinding stones themselves are marvels of engineering that represent centuries of refinement in the technology of grain processing. The lower stone, the meta, is carved from volcanic rock quarried near Naples, chosen for its hardness and abrasive properties. The surface is carefully textured with ridges and grooves that help grip the grain and move it through the grinding chamber. The upper stone, the catalyst, is made from the same material, but shaped to create the precise gaps and pressures necessary for efficient grinding. Maintaining these stones requires specialized knowledge that goes far beyond the simple labor of walking in circles. The grinding surfaces must be periodically dressed, recut, and retextured to maintain their effectiveness. The alignment of the stones must be constantly adjusted to compensate for wear and temperature changes. The gap between the stones must be varied, depending on the type of grain being processed and the desired fineness of the flour. This maintenance work is performed by skilled craftsmen who visit the mill periodically. But the day-to-day adjustments are the responsibility of Gaius. You have learned to recognize the signs that indicate when the stones need attention. Changes in the sound of grinding. Variations in the resistance of the wooden beam. Differences in the color and texture of the flour being produced. This knowledge gives you a small measure of power within the grinding chamber's rigid hierarchy. When Mill 4 begins producing inferior flour, Gaius must rely on your observations to diagnose the problem. When the grinding becomes inefficient, your assessment of the cause influences his decisions about adjustments and repairs. This technical knowledge cannot free you from slavery, but it does provide occasional opportunities to influence your working conditions. The seasonal rhythm of the mill follows the agricultural calendar of the Roman Empire. Spring brings new crops from Egypt and North Africa, grain with high moisture content that requires careful handling to prevent spoilage during grinding. Summer brings the harvest from Italian estates, familiar grains that process predictably and efficiently. Autumn brings experimental shipments from newly conquered territories, exotic varieties that require careful testing to determine optimal grinding techniques. Winter is the most challenging season, when grain supplies may be interrupted by storms at sea or political upheavals in distant provinces. During these periods, the mill may process inferior grain damaged by moisture, contaminated with foreign matter, or simply too old to grind easily. The slaves must work harder to maintain productivity with these difficult materials, often grinding for longer hours to compensate for reduced efficiency. But the seasonal variations that most affect your daily life are not agricultural, but social. During the winter months, when Pompeii's social season is at its peak, the demand for fine flour increases dramatically. Wealthy families hosting elaborate dinner parties require the whitest, finest flour for their bread and pastries. This demand creates pressure throughout the milling system, as every stage of production must operate with maximum efficiency to meet the orders. These periods of high demand are both blessing and curse for the slaves in the grinding chamber. The increased production means longer working hours and greater physical strain. But it also means that the mill's profitability is at its peak, which sometimes translates into slightly better food or minor improvements in working conditions. More importantly, the intense focus on production during these periods creates opportunities for small acts of resistance or sabotage that might otherwise be impossible. You have learned to read the subtle signs that indicate when such opportunities might arise. When Gaius is distracted by pressure from his master to meet delivery deadlines, his supervision becomes less intense. When the mill is processing particularly difficult grain that requires constant adjustment, the complexity of the work creates moments when individual slaves can exercise discretion about their pace and technique. These opportunities are rare and dangerous, but they provide brief respites from the grinding routine and occasional chances to help fellow slaves. A moment's reduction in grinding pressure can allow a weaker slave to catch his breath. A subtle adjustment to grain flow can create a brief pause in the work. These small acts of solidarity are invisible to the overseers, but essential to maintaining morale among the slaves. The hierarchy among the slaves themselves reflects the brutal logic of survival under extreme conditions. Those who have been in the mill longest have developed techniques for conserving energy and minimizing injury. They know which grinding positions are least demanding, which times of day offer the best opportunities for rest, which behaviors are most likely to attract punishment from the overseers. This knowledge is shared selectively, creating informal alliances and rivalries that shape daily life in the grinding chamber. New slaves, like the young Gaul who arrived last month, must prove their trustworthiness before being accepted into these networks. Slaves who are suspected of informing on their fellows are isolated and sometimes subjected to violence that the overseers either do not see or choose to ignore. Your own position in this hierarchy is complex and somewhat precarious. Your strength and endurance make you valuable to the other slaves, but your intelligence and resistance to the system make you dangerous from their perspective. Some see you as a potential leader who might organize resistance or escape attempts. Others view you as a threat who might attract unwanted attention from the overseers through your defiance. As the afternoon wears on and the grinding continues, you find yourself thinking about the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the Roman milling system. The empire's prosperity depends on efficient grain processing, which requires skilled, motivated workers. But the use of slave labor creates workers who are neither skilled nor motivated, who have every incentive to work as little as possible and no incentive to improve efficiency or quality. This contradiction is managed through constant surveillance and the threat of violence, but these control mechanisms create their own inefficiencies. Gaius must spend much of his time watching for signs of resistance or sabotage rather than focusing on production improvements. The slaves must devote mental energy to avoiding punishment rather than optimizing their work techniques. The entire system operates at a level of efficiency far below what might be achieved with free labor. But free labor would cost more than slave labor, at least in the short term. The initial purchase price of a slave represents the total labor cost for several years of work, while free workers must be paid daily wages that quickly exceed the cost of slave maintenance. This economic calculation drives the continued use of slave labor despite its obvious inefficiencies. As evening approaches and the day's grinding quota nears completion, you contemplate the larger forces that have created your situation and that might eventually change it. The Roman Empire's expansion has created a steady supply of slaves through conquest and war. But it has also created economic pressures that may eventually make slave labor less attractive. The growth of cities and trade has increased the demand for skilled workers who cannot easily be replaced by slaves. The development of new technologies may create opportunities for more efficient grain processing that do not depend on human labor. These changes, if they come at all, will come slowly and may not benefit the current generation of slaves. But they represent the only hope for fundamental change in a system that reduces human beings to mechanical components in a grain processing machine. And in that hope, however faint, lies the possibility that someday the grinding mills of Rome will operate without chains, without whips, without the daily sacrifice of human dignity that currently turns grain into gruel. The stones continue their endless rotation as darkness falls over Pompeii, grinding grain into flour as they have for generations and as they will continue until the volcanic eruption that will soon bury. The city preserves this scene of human misery for future generations to discover and contemplate. The night in the grinding chamber is almost worse than the day. When the mills finally stop and the last load of flour is carried away to the bakery, you and your fellow slaves are locked into the same space where you have labored for 12 hours, with no escape from the dust-laden air, the lingering heat from the grinding stones, or the constant presence of your chains and collars. Sleep comes, fitfully on beds of straw that are changed infrequently and provide minimal comfort against the hard stone floor. The air remains thick with flour dust that irritates your throat and lungs, causing many slaves to develop the persistent cough that marks those who have worked long in the mills. The animal's 3 donkeys who share your imprisonment add their own odors and sounds to the already oppressive atmosphere. But it is during these night hours, when the overseer has gone to his own quarters and the immediate pressure of production has been lifted, that you sometimes hear the stories that remind you why this system of grinding grain with human labor represents something uniquely evil in the long history of food processing. Old Tertius, a Dacian slave who has worked these mills for nearly 15 years, tells tales of his homeland where grain was ground by women using hand querns, working in their own homes at their own pace. The work was hard and time-consuming, he recalls, but it was done by free people for their own families, not by slaves chained to machines for the profit of masters, who regarded them as less valuable than the animals with whom they worked. From Gaius the Gaul come stories of mills powered by rivers and streams, where the force of water, rather than human muscle, provided the energy for grinding. These tales seem fantastic to slaves who have known only the brutal reality of human-powered mills. But they suggest that alternatives to the current system are not only possible, but already exist in some parts of the empire. Most haunting are the stories told by Marcus the Egyptian, an educated man who once served as a scribe before being enslaved for debts he could not pay. He describes the grain processing systems of his homeland, where free women ground grain using methods that had remained unchanged for thousands of years. The work was difficult, but it was integrated into the normal rhythm of household life. Performed by people who controlled their own time and who benefited directly from their labor. These stories serve multiple purposes in the grinding chamber's social ecosystem. They provide mental escape from the immediate reality of enslavement, allowing the slaves to imagine alternatives to their current situation. They preserve memories of different ways of organizing society, keeping alive the knowledge that the Roman system of slave-powered mills is not the only possible way to process grain. Most importantly, they provide a framework for understanding their suffering not as natural or inevitable, but as the product of specific economic and social arrangements that could, in theory, be changed. The technical knowledge that you have acquired during your years at the mill also shapes your understanding of the system's vulnerabilities. You know that the grinding stones require constant maintenance that depends on the skills of free craftsmen who cannot be easily replaced. You understand that the mill's efficiency depends on the cooperation of slaves who have every incentive to work as slowly as possible without attracting punishment. You have observed that the entire operation is vulnerable to disruptions in the grain supply, equipment failures, or labor shortages that could quickly bring production to a halt. This knowledge gives you a different perspective on your enslavement than that possessed by slaves who work in simpler occupations. While a slave laboring in a field or carrying goods in a warehouse might see his situation as completely hopeless, you understand that the milling operation depends on a complex system that has many potential points of failure. This understanding does not provide any immediate path to freedom, but it does suggest strategies for resistance that go beyond simple refusal to work. The most sophisticated form of resistance available to mill slaves is the deliberate degradation of product quality. By making subtle adjustments to grinding pressure, feed rates, or stone alignment, an experienced slave can produce flour that appears acceptable to casual inspection. But that will create problems when it is used for baking. Bread made from improperly ground flour may fail to rise properly, develop off flavors, or spoil more quickly than normal. This form of sabotage is extremely dangerous because it can be detected by experienced bakers who understand the relationship between flour quality and bread performance. A slave caught deliberately producing inferior flour faces brutal punishment, including the possibility of being worked to death in even more demanding assignments. But the risks are balanced by the satisfaction of striking back at the system that has destroyed your life and the hope that systematic quality problems might eventually force changes in working conditions. You have occasionally engaged in this form of resistance, though always with careful attention to the risks involved. A slight reduction in grinding pressure during the processing of grain destined for a wealthy customer's table. A minor adjustment to stone alignment that will create texture problems in the finished flour. These small acts of defiance provide psychological relief while remaining almost impossible to trace to individual slaves. The economic calculations that govern the mill's operation become more apparent to you as your experience grows. Lucius Crassus Fortunatus has invested significant capital in the grinding equipment, the building, and the slave workforce, and he expects a substantial return on this investment. The mill must process enough grain each day to cover operating costs. equipment, maintenance, slave upkeep, taxes, and profit. This means that productivity per slave is constantly monitored and optimized through a combination of incentives and punishments. The most effective incentive is survival itself. Slaves who fail to maintain adequate productivity are sold to mining operations or gladiator schools where life expectancy is measured in months rather than years. The most common punishment is reduced food rations, a penalty that quickly affects work capacity and creates a downward spiral of declining performance and increasing punishment. But the system also includes some positive incentives designed to encourage cooperation and maintain morale. Slaves who consistently exceed production targets may receive slightly better food, occasional wine rations, or assignment to less demanding grinding positions. The most cooperative slaves may eventually be promoted to positions of limited authority. Within the mill hierarchy, though always under the supervision of free overseers, these incentives create complex dynamics among the slave workforce. Some slaves genuinely compete for the small privileges available within the system, working harder and reporting on their fellows in hopes of improving their own situations. Others reject any cooperation with the system, viewing such incentives as attempts to corrupt their resistance to enslavement. Most occupy a middle ground, doing enough to avoid punishment while maintaining their dignity and solidarity with fellow slaves. Your own strategy has evolved over the years from open resistance to a more subtle form of non-cooperation. You perform. You're assigned tasks competently enough to avoid punishment, but you refuse to compete for privileges or to inform on other slaves. You use your technical knowledge to help maintain the equipment when necessary, but you also use it to identify opportunities for subtle sabotage when the risks are manageable. This approach has earned you the grudging respect of both the overseers and your fellow slaves. Gaius recognizes your competence and relies on your observations about mill performance. But he also understands that you will never become a loyal supporter of the system. The other slaves appreciate your refusal to compete for privileges at their expense. But they also worry that your intelligence and resistance make you a target for special attention from the authorities. As winter deepens and the grinding work continues with its relentless demands, you begin to understand something that will influence your thinking for the rest of your life. The Roman system of slave-powered grain processing represents a fundamental choice about how society should be organized. The empire has chosen to base its food production system on the assumption that some human beings can be reduced to mechanical components, valued only for their capacity to perform repetitive physical labor. This choice has consequences that extend far beyond the mills themselves. A society that accepts the enslavement of grain processors implicitly accepts the principle that human beings can be treated as property when it serves economic interests. The techniques of control and coercion developed in the mill surveillance, punishment, the systematic destruction of human dignity, become models for managing other forms of labor and social organization. But the choice is not inevitable or permanent. The stories told by older slaves suggest that other societies have found different ways to organize grain processing. Methods that preserve human dignity while still meeting the practical requirements of food production. The technical knowledge you have acquired demonstrates that efficient milling depends more on proper equipment and procedures than on the brutal application of slave labor. The question that haunts your sleepless nights is whether the Roman system will eventually be forced to change by its own contradictions and inefficiencies, or whether it will persist until some external force destroys it entirely. The empire's expansion has provided a steady supply of slaves to replace those who die in the mills, but this supply is not unlimited. The growing complexity of Roman society has created demands for skilled workers who cannot easily be enslaved. The development of new technologies may eventually make human-powered mills obsolete. These changes, they occur, will happen slowly and may not benefit the current generation of mill slaves. but they represent the only realistic hope for fundamental transformation of the system that has reduced you and your fellow workers to the level of livestock. And in that distant possibility of change lies the strength to endure another day of grinding, another revolution around the stones, another small contribution to the vast machinery that turns grain into gruel for the tables of Rome. The pre-dawn hours bring the sound of Gaius's footsteps on the stairs, the rattle of keys, the beginning of another day's labor. The grinding stones stand ready, the grain hoppers are filled. The wooden beams wait for hands to push them in their endless circles. In a few moments, you will take your position at Mill 4 and begin the process that will occupy every moment of the next 12 hours. But as you prepare for another day of labor, you carry with you the knowledge that this system is not eternal, that the choices that created it can be unmade, that somewhere in the future lies the possibility of grain processing that does not require the sacrifice of human dignity. This knowledge cannot free you from your chains, but it can preserve your humanity in the face of a system designed to destroy it. And perhaps, someday, future generations will look back at the slave mills of Rome as a cautionary tale about the dangers of reducing human beings to mechanical components in the endless task of turning grain into gruel. The year is 1785, and you are standing in the Red Clay Creek Mill near Newport, Delaware, watching a revolution in motion. Your name is Samuel Wright, and as a journeyman millwright, you have been summoned to witness what Oliver Evans claims is the future of grain processing. A mill that operates without human hands touching the grain from the moment it enters the building until it emerges as finished flour. Oliver Evans, at 30 years old, has the intense focus of a man obsessed with mechanical perfection. He moves through his mill like a conductor directing an orchestra, pointing out each innovation with the enthusiasm of someone who has spent 15 years perfecting a system that most people consider impossible. "Mark this well, Samuel," he says, his voice carrying the pride of achievement mixed with frustration at the skepticism his innovations have encountered. "What you see here will change not just milling, but manufacturing itself." The mill building rises 4 stories above the creek, its timber frame construction designed to accommodate the vertical movement of grain and flour that Evans has engineered. Unlike traditional mills, where workers carry heavy sacks up and down stairs countless times each day, this building is organized around the principle of continuous flow. Grain enters at the top level and emerges as flour at the bottom, transformed by a series of mechanical processes that require minimal human intervention. You have worked in mills throughout Pennsylvania and Delaware, and you understand the traditional system that Evans is attempting to replace. In a conventional mill, every operation requires manual labor, carrying grain to the grinding stones, adjusting the machinery, moving the ground meal to cleaning and bolting equipment, bagging the finished flour. A typical mill employs 6 to 8 workers who spend their days in constant motion, lifting, carrying, and manipulating heavy materials in a process that has remained essentially unchanged since medieval times. Evans begins his demonstration at the grain elevator, a vertical conveyor system that lifts grain from the basement level to the top floor of the mill. The mechanism consists of a continuous belt with small buckets attached at regular intervals, powered by the same water wheel that drives the grinding stones. As each bucket reaches the bottom of the elevator, it scoops up grain from a receiving hopper, carries it to the top of the building, then dumps it into a storage bin before returning for another load. "Observe the capacity," Evans instructs, as you watch the steady stream of grain ascending to the top floor. This elevator can lift 5 bushels per minute, 40 bushels per hour, 300 bushels in a working day. Compare that to a man carrying grain sacks up 3 flights of stairs. How many bushels could he move in a day? 50? 60? And at what cost to his body and health? The elevator is indeed impressive, but you understand the skepticism that Evans has encountered from other millers. The mechanism is complex, with multiple potential points of failure. The belt must be precisely tensioned to prevent slippage. The buckets must be carefully aligned to ensure proper filling and dumping. The power transmission from the water wheel must be carefully regulated to maintain optimal speed. A traditional mill worker may be slower than the elevator, but he is also more reliable and easier to repair when problems arise. From the storage bins at the top of the mill, grain flows by gravity to the grinding stones on the floor below. This gravity feed system represents another innovation that eliminates manual labor while improving consistency. The flow rate is controlled by adjustable gates that can be set to deliver grain to the stones at precisely the rate needed for optimal grinding. No worker is needed to monitor the process or carry grain to the mills. The grinding stones themselves are conventional. But Evans has refined their operation through careful attention to balance, alignment, and power transmission. The gap between the stones can be adjusted with unprecedented precision using a system of levers and screws that allows for fine-tuning. Based on the type of grain being processed and the desired fineness of the flour, the stones are dressed with improved tools that create more effective grinding surfaces, increasing efficiency while reducing wear. But the most revolutionary innovation comes after the grinding is complete. In traditional mills, the ground meal must be manually carried to separate buildings or rooms where it is cleaned, sifted, and bolted to remove bran and foreign matter. This process requires several workers and multiple handling operations that increase labor costs while creating opportunities for contamination and loss. Evans has eliminated these manual operations through his system of conveyors and mechanical cleaners. The ground meal falls from the stones into a horizontal conveyor screw mechanism, enclosed in a wooden trough that moves the meal to cleaning equipment without human intervention. The screw conveyor, or Archimedes screw as Evans calls it, can handle large volumes of meal while preventing spillage and contamination. The cleaning process has been mechanized through a system of sieves and air currents that separate grain from chaff, dust, and foreign matter. The cleaned meal then moves automatically to the bolting room, where it is sifted through silk cloths of varying fineness to produce different grades of flour. Even this final process has been automated through mechanical agitators that keep the meal moving through the bolting cloths without manual stirring. Consider the implications. Evans says as you watch flour flowing into storage bins with no human hands involved in the process. From grain to flour, the entire process is mechanical. One man can operate this mill, monitoring the machinery and making adjustments as needed. The grain is handled more gently, with less damage and contamination. The flour is more uniform in quality because the processing conditions are consistent, and the cost of production is reduced by more than half compared to traditional methods. You are impressed by the ingenuity of Evans's system, but you also understand the challenges it faces in gaining acceptance. The initial cost of construction is substantially higher than a traditional mill, requiring precision machinery and complex power transmission systems that most millwrights cannot build or maintain. The operation requires careful monitoring and skilled maintenance that may not be available in rural communities where most mills are located. More significantly, the automated mill threatens the livelihoods of thousands of mill workers whose skills become obsolete when grain processing is mechanized. These workers represent a substantial investment in training and experience that mill owners are reluctant to abandon. They also represent a political force that can influence community attitudes toward new technology. Evans is well aware of these challenges, but he believes that the economic advantages of his system will ultimately overcome resistance to change. The future belongs to efficiency, Samuel, he argues. Mills that can produce better flour at lower cost will drive out mills that depend on expensive manual labor. The workers displaced by these machines will find employment in new industries that the increased efficiency makes possible. This argument reflects the optimism of the early industrial age. The belief that technological progress necessarily improves human welfare by increasing productivity and reducing costs. But you have seen enough of industrial development to understand that the benefits of mechanization are not automatically distributed to those displaced by new technology. The mill workers who lose their jobs may not find equivalent employment in other industries, and the communities that depend on mill employment may suffer economic disruption that lasts for generations. As Evans continues his demonstration, showing you the mechanical systems that control temperature, moisture, and flow rates throughout the mill, you begin to understand that you are witnessing more than just an improvement in grain processing technology. This automated mill represents a fundamental change in the relationship between human labor and mechanical production, a shift that will ultimately transform not just milling but all forms of manufacturing. The traditional mill is a workplace where skilled craftsmen use tools to perform complex operations that require judgment, experience, and adaptability. Evans's mill is a machine that performs these same operations through mechanical processes that can be standardized, controlled, and replicated. The human role changes from craftsman to operator, from someone who performs skilled labor to someone who monitors and adjusts mechanical systems. This transformation has profound implications for the social organization of work and the economic relationships that govern production. In a traditional mill, the miller's expertise and the worker's skills create value that they can claim through wages and profits. In an automated mill, value is created primarily by machinery, and the returns to capital investment become more important than the returns to labor. As the demonstration concludes and you prepare to return to your own work, Evans makes a prediction that will prove remarkably prescient. What you have seen here is just the beginning. The principles of continuous flow and mechanical handling can be applied to any manufacturing process. Textiles, lumber, metalworking, all of these industries will be transformed by similar innovations. We are witnessing the birth of a new age of production. You leave the Red Clay Creek Mill with mixed feelings about what you have witnessed. The technical achievements are undeniably impressive, and the potential benefits in terms of efficiency and product quality are clear. But you also understand that this revolution in grain processing represents a fundamental challenge to the traditional organization of work and community that has sustained American society since its founding. The question that haunts you as you travel back to your own mill is whether the benefits of mechanization will justify the disruption it causes to established ways of life. Will the increased efficiency of automated mills provide enough economic benefit to compensate for the displacement of skilled workers? Will communities be able to adapt to the new forms of economic organization that mechanization requires? And what will be lost in the transition from human-centered to machine-centered production? These are questions that will be answered not by inventors and engineers, but by the ordinary people whose lives are transformed by technological change. And as you return to the familiar rhythm of traditional milling, with its reliance on human skill and physical labor, you wonder how long it will be before every mill in America operates according to Oliver Evans's revolutionary principles. The winter of 1790 finds you back at the Red Clay Creek Mill, but this time as the head millwright overseeing the construction of Evans's second automated facility. 5 years have passed since your first encounter with the revolutionary grain processing system, and in that time you have witnessed the gradual spread of Evans's innovations throughout the Delaware Valley and beyond. What began as a single experimental mill has grown into a movement that is transforming American manufacturing. The new mill is larger and more sophisticated than the original, incorporating refinements that Evans has developed through years of operational experience. The grain elevator system has been improved with better bucket design and more reliable power transmission. The conveyor systems now include multiple parallel lines that can handle different types of grain simultaneously. The bolting machinery has been enhanced with improved silk cloths and more precise mechanical agitators. But the most significant change is not technological, but economic. Where the original mill was viewed with skepticism by potential customers and investors, the new facility has attracted substantial financial backing from Philadelphia merchants, who understand the competitive advantages of automated grain processing. The economics of milling have shifted decisively in favor of mechanization, driven by the superior quality and lower cost of flour produced by Evans's system. You now supervise a crew of 12 craftsmen who are building what amounts to a grain processing factory. The workers include traditional millwrights, like yourself, but also specialists in new trades that have emerged to support industrial development. Machinists who can fabricate precision gears and mechanical components, engineers who understand power transmission and mechanical systems, and what Evans calls industrial managers, who can coordinate complex production processes. The construction process itself reflects the principles of the mill it is creating. Where traditional mill building relied on the accumulated wisdom of craftsmen working with familiar materials and techniques, this project requires detailed planning, precise specifications, and careful coordination of specialized trades. Evans has created drawings and written instructions that specify every aspect of the mill's construction, from the dimensions of structural timbers to the tolerances of mechanical components. This systematization of construction knowledge represents another aspect of the Industrial Revolution that Evans is helping to create. Complex projects can no longer be managed through informal communication and traditional craft knowledge. They require written documentation, standardized procedures, and hierarchical management structures that can coordinate the work of specialists who may not understand the overall system they are helping to create. Your role in this process has evolved from craftsman to manager, from someone who builds things with his hands to someone who coordinates the work of others. You spend your days reading Evans's technical drawings, calculating material requirements, scheduling work crews, and solving problems that arise when theoretical designs encounter practical realities. The skills that made you a successful millwright, your understanding of wood and stone, your ability to judge mechanical tolerances by sight and feel remain important. But they are now supplemented by new skills in planning, communication, and systematic problem solving. The workers under your supervision are experiencing their own transformations as they adapt to industrial construction methods. Traditional millwrights were accustomed to working independently, making decisions based on their individual expertise and taking responsibility for complete sections of a project. The new system requires them to follow detailed specifications, coordinate their work with other specialists, and subordinate their individual judgment to the requirements of the overall system. This change creates tensions that reflect broader social adjustments to industrial development. Older workers sometimes resist the new methods, arguing that their traditional approaches are more reliable and produce better results. Younger workers may embrace the systematization, but lose some of the intuitive understanding that comes from learning a craft through apprenticeship and experience. You find yourself mediating between these different approaches while trying to maintain project schedules and quality standards. The technical challenges of building an automated mill also reveal the limits of current manufacturing capabilities. Many of the mechanical components that Evans's system requires precision gears, carefully balanced shafts, smoothly operating bearings cannot be produced reliably with existing tools and techniques. You spend considerable time developing new fabrication methods and quality control procedures that can produce components meeting the demanding specifications of automated machinery. These challenges force innovations in metallurgy, precision, manufacturing, and quality control that extend far beyond milling applications. The techniques developed to build better grain elevators find applications in textile machinery, lumber processing, and other industrial operations. The principles of systematic design and construction that Evans applies to mills become models for other forms of industrial development. As construction progresses and the mill begins to take shape, you observe the economic effects of industrial development on the surrounding community. The demand for skilled workers has attracted craftsmen from throughout the region, creating a temporary boom in employment and wages. Local suppliers of materials, lumber, iron, stone have expanded their operations to meet the project's requirements. Taverns, boarding houses, and other service businesses have grown to accommodate the increased population. But you also observe the disruption that industrial development creates for established economic relationships. Traditional mills in the area are losing customers to automated facilities that can produce better flour at lower prices. Mill workers displaced by mechanization are seeking employment in other trades, creating competition that depresses wages. For skilled craftsmen, small farmers who depend on local mills for grain, processing must travel greater distances to reach facilities that can handle their crops. These economic adjustments reflect the broader transformation of American society, from an agricultural to an industrial economy. The efficiency gains from mechanization create wealth that can support larger populations and more complex economic activities. But the benefits are not distributed evenly. Communities and individuals who can adapt to industrial methods prosper, while those who cannot adapt may find themselves economically marginalized. Evans himself has become a prominent advocate for industrial development, writing articles and giving speeches that promote the benefits of mechanization while minimizing its disruptive effects. He argues that automated production will ultimately benefit everyone by reducing the cost of essential goods and creating new opportunities for employment and investment. But you have seen enough of the transition process to understand that the benefits of industrialization come with significant social costs that are borne primarily by those least able to adapt to change. The mill nears completion as spring arrives. In 1791, and Evans begins preparing for the operational phase of the project. This involves training a new type of mill operator who can monitor and adjust complex mechanical systems rather than performing physical labor. The skills required are different from those of traditional mill workers, more emphasis on understanding mechanical relationships and system interactions, less emphasis on physical strength and manual dexterity. Finding and training such workers proves more challenging than Evans anticipated. Men with a mechanical aptitude to operate automated systems often lack the practical experience in grain processing needed to make proper adjustments. Experienced mill workers often resist the transition from manual to mechanical operations, preferring familiar methods to new procedures they do not fully understand. This training challenge highlights a fundamental issue in industrial development: the need to create human resources that can effectively utilize new technology. Traditional apprenticeship systems that developed craft skills over many years must be supplemented or replaced by more intensive training programs that can quickly develop the specific skills needed for industrial operations. As you oversee the final stages of construction, you reflect on the broader implications of what you have helped to create. This automated mill represents more than just an improvement in grain processing efficiency. It embodies a new vision of how human society can organize production and distribute the benefits of technological progress. The traditional system of craft production emphasized individual skill, local knowledge, and community-based economic relationships. The industrial system emphasizes mechanical efficiency, standardized procedures, and market-based economic relationships that can extend across vast geographic regions. Both systems have advantages and disadvantages, but the transition from one to the other creates challenges that affect every aspect of social organization that concerns you as the mill prepares to begin operations is whether American society can successfully manage this transition while preserving the values and relationships that have made democratic government and social stability possible. Industrial development offers the promise of increased prosperity and expanded opportunities. But it also creates new forms of economic inequality and social disruption that may threaten the foundations of Republican society. These are not questions that can be answered by engineers and millwrights, but they are questions that will be shaped by the decisions made in projects like the one you have just completed. The automated mill that stands ready to begin operations represents both the promise and the peril of industrial development, and its success or failure will influence the direction of American society for generations to come. The autumn of 1795 finds you in a position you never expected to occupy, industrial consultant to mill owners throughout the Mid-Atlantic region. Evans's automated milling system has proven so successful that demand for similar installations has outstripped the supply of craftsmen capable of building them. You have spent the past 4 years traveling from site to site, overseeing construction projects and training operators, becoming an expert in a technology that barely existed when you first encountered it. The mill you are currently completing in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, represents the most advanced application of Evans's principles. To date, this facility incorporates not just automated grain handling, but also steam power backup for periods when water flow is insufficient, mechanical systems for temperature and moisture control, and quality monitoring equipment that can detect variations in flour characteristics that would be invisible to human operators. But success has brought complications that neither you nor Evans anticipated. The automated mills have been so effective at reducing production costs that they have triggered a transformation of the entire grain market. Small local mills cannot compete with the efficiency of mechanized facilities, leading to the consolidation of milling into fewer, larger operations. This consolidation has disrupted traditional community relationships while creating new forms of economic organization that span multiple states. The social effects of this transformation are visible in every community where you work. Mill workers, displaced by mechanization, have been forced to seek employment in other industries, often at reduced wages and in less stable positions. Small farmers who once relied on local mills now must transport their grain to distant facilities, increasing their costs while reducing their control over processing quality and timing. Some communities have adapted successfully to these changes, using the increased efficiency of automated mills to support expanded economic activities. Lancaster has become a regional center for flour distribution, creating employment in transportation, warehousing, and commercial services that compensates for the loss of traditional mill jobs. But other communities have struggled with the transition, experiencing population decline and economic stagnation as traditional industries disappear without being replaced by new opportunities. The technical challenges of industrial development have also proven more complex than initially anticipated. Automated machinery requires regular maintenance by skilled mechanics who command high wages and may not be available in rural communities. The precision components that make mechanization possible are expensive to replace and vulnerable to damage from improper operation or inadequate maintenance. These reliability issues have forced innovations in industrial organization that extend far beyond milling applications. Evans has established training programs for machinery operators and maintenance technicians, creating new forms of technical education that supplement traditional apprenticeship systems. He has also developed supply networks for replacement parts and maintenance, services that can support automated facilities in remote locations. Your own role in this industrial ecosystem has evolved continuously as the technology has matured. You began as a traditional millwright, learned to become a construction manager, and now function as what might be called an industrial engineer, someone who understands not just how automated systems work, but how they interact with the economic and social environments in which they operate. This broader perspective has given you insights into the systemic effects of industrial development that are not apparent to those focused on specific technical problems. You have observed that mechanization creates benefits and costs that are distributed unevenly across different groups and communities. You have seen how technological change can disrupt established social relationships, while creating new forms of economic organization that may be more efficient but less stable than traditional systems. The current project in Lancaster has forced you to confront these systemic issues directly because the mill's customers include both large commercial buyers and small farmers who represent very different economic interests. The commercial buyers want standardized products delivered according to predictable schedules at the lowest possible prices. The small farmers want flexible service that accommodates their irregular production cycles and quality, requirements that may vary with local conditions. Reconciling these competing demands has required innovations in mill operations that go beyond the mechanical systems that Evans originally developed. The facility includes multiple processing lines that can handle different types of grain simultaneously, storage systems that can maintain quality while providing flexibility in delivery schedules, and business procedures that can accommodate both large-scale commercial transactions and small-scale individual orders. These organizational innovations reflect a broader evolution in industrial development from simple mechanization to complex systems integration. Early automated facilities focused primarily on replacing human labor with mechanical processes. More advanced systems integrate mechanical, organizational, and informational components to create capabilities that exceed what either human or mechanical systems could achieve independently. The human resources required to operate these advanced systems represent another dimension of industrial development that has proven more challenging than anticipated. Traditional craft workers possess deep knowledge of specific processes, but may lack the systematic thinking required to manage complex, integrated systems. Formally educated engineers may understand mechanical principles, but lack practical experience. With production operations, creating workers who combine theoretical knowledge with practical skills has required new approaches to technical education that blend classroom instruction with hands-on experience. You have been involved in developing training programs that teach both the mechanical principles underlying automated systems and the practical skills needed to operate and maintain them effectively. These educational innovations are part of a broader transformation of American society that extends far beyond manufacturing industries. The success of industrial development requires not just new technology, but new forms of social organization that can effectively utilize that technology. This includes educational systems that can develop appropriate skills, economic institutions that can finance and manage complex projects, and political systems that can mediate the conflicts created by rapid social change, as the Lancaster Mill prepares to begin operations. You reflect on the 10 years that have passed since you first witnessed Evans's revolutionary grain processing system. The technology has proven remarkably successful, spreading throughout the American economy and contributing to economic growth that has exceeded all expectations. But the social adjustments required by industrial development have proven more difficult and disruptive than anyone anticipated. The traditional American economy was based on small-scale, locally controlled enterprises that provided economic security through diversified community relationships. The industrial economy offers greater efficiency and expanded opportunities, but it also creates new forms of economic uncertainty and social disruption that challenge traditional values and institutions. The question that concerns you as you prepare to move on to the next project is whether American society can successfully manage the transition to industrial organization while preserving the democratic values and social relationships that distinguish it from European societies. Industrial development offers the promise of prosperity and progress, but it also creates new forms of economic inequality and social conflict that may threaten political stability. These concerns are not merely theoretical. You have observed in your travels how industrial development affects different communities and social groups. Some benefit greatly from new opportunities, while others suffer displacement and marginalization. Some communities adapt successfully to economic change, while others experience decline and social fragmentation. The mill that stands ready to begin operations in Lancaster represents both the achievements and the challenges of American industrial development. Its mechanical systems embody remarkable innovations in engineering and manufacturing. Its economic performance demonstrates the benefits of systematic organization and technological efficiency, but its social effects remain uncertain, dependent on how successfully the broader society adapts to the changes it represents. As you pack your tools and prepare for the next assignment, you carry with you the knowledge that you have participated in something historically significant, the transformation of an agricultural society into an industrial one. This transformation has created unprecedented opportunities for economic advancement and social mobility, but it has also disrupted traditional relationships and institutions in ways that may take generations to fully resolve. The automated mills that now process grain throughout America have made possible a level of productivity and lapse level of productivity and economic growth that seemed impossible when you first witnessed Evans's experimental facility. But they have also created new questions about how society should organize production, distribute wealth, and maintain social cohesion in an economy based on mechanical efficiency rather than human relationships. These questions will be answered not by engineers and millwrights, but by the millions of Americans whose lives are being transformed by industrial development. The success of that transformation will depend on whether American society can harness the benefits of mechanization while managing its disruptive effects in ways that preserve democratic values and social stability. The future remains uncertain. But one thing is clear: the age of grain processing by human labor alone has ended. What began as Oliver Evans's vision of automated milling has become a revolution that is transforming not just how grain is processed, but how American society organizes all forms of production. And in that transformation lies both the promise and the peril of the modern industrial world.